Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's good to be with you here today. We're going to talk with John West on his book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. I think this is a great book, highly recommended, and we're going to get into a lot of fun questions in the episode about how to identify a Stockholm Syndrome Christian and how it plays out today. Before we get into that, I want to remind you about the Patreon, where you can get early access to every episode, some swag, and direct access to me. You can recommend podcast guests and have any kind of questions answered about any episode on the Patreon. Also wanted to remind you of Farmer Bill Provisions, farmerbillprovisions.com. Use code FoolProofTheology to get 20% off your first order. If you're looking to get more protein in your diet, which I am, as I lift weights and want to be healthy, this is a great resource for you. You need to head to Farmer Bill Provisions and get some biltong. This is an alternative to beef jerky, traditional beef jerky that you might pick up from a 7-Eleven or a gas station that's filled with all sorts of additives and things that you cannot pronounce. Farmer Bill does not do that. He is using a very limited selection of means to make a version of beef jerky called biltong. It's great. It's for a snack on the go, can keep your diet protein rich. Head over to farmerbillsprovisions.com. Use code FOOLPROOF to get 20% off your order. Another partner of the program is Legacy Profits Club. This is a great way to become independent and not dependent on your job. You can build wealth and learn how the stock market works, getting training and coaching, because there's a lot of risks that go into the stock market. A lot of people think it's like gambling when it's not. And my friend Derek over there does a great job of providing classes and education and one-on-one coaching. Head over to Legacy Profits Club, get involved in trading today, and you can use the link in the show notes to sign up for his course. The last thing I want to remind you of is a product I use called Ion Layer. Ion Layer is a medical grade patch that helps you with NAD plus infusions. If none of that makes sense, it all sounds like Greek to you, just know that this improves your life. This helps you. It helps with your mental acuity, feelings of tiredness in the morning, helps your body recover after a workout. These patches are really a game changer when it comes to getting a supplement that's much more affordable than you can get in an IV treatment. So you can head over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. These kits are already super affordable. They get cleared by a doctor, and you can get them at an even greater discount by heading to ionlayer.com, use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's good to be with you here today. We have a wonderful guest named Dr. John West. He is the author of Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. He has kind of a long pedigree of being I wouldn't call him Big Eva, but he has a good reputation within the Christian community, evangelical community in America. He's the vice president of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, co-founder of the Center for Science and Culture. Dr. West, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Chase, thanks for having me.
Well, I wanted to lead off right off the bat. Tell me kind of some more of your story. You know, you interacted, and in your book, you cover a lot of interaction you've had with the academy, the scientific community, organizations like BioLogos. Well, you haven't had as much interaction with them as much as you've critiqued them in the book, but kind of tell me some more of your story.
Yeah, well, I've actually had interactions with BioLogos over the years, but yeah. So I spent about 12 years in Christian higher education. I was a professor at a historically evangelical school called Seattle Pacific University, and I was chair of the Department of Political Science there. I also, pretty much at the same time, actually, before I went to SPU, I was involved with Discovery Institute, and that's where I founded with Steve Meyer the program, the Center for Science and Culture, which really is sort of the institutional hub of something known as intelligent design. Scientists like Michael Behe, Bill Dembski, others who think that there's evidence of purpose in nature. We're not just an accidental process, and that have pushed against sort of Darwinian biology and biology. And so those are the two things that sort of define my certainly, postgraduate school. My PhD from Claremont is in government. And so that's what I taught at Seattle Pacific, dealing with sort of government, American founding, religious liberty, constitutionalism. And then with Discovery, I sort of focus on the use and abuse of science in policy and culture, and helping to stand up for many of the people who are arguing counterculturally, defending their free speech to do that. So in between, I've written a lot of books. I love C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. So for Zondervan years ago, I co-edited an encyclopedia on C.S. Lewis. I've written or actually edited and written a book about C.S. Lewis's scientism. I've done some stuff on the American founding. I've done documentaries. You can find a lot of those on YouTube and elsewhere, focusing primarily on the interaction between science and culture and scientism and culture. So that's just a little thumbnail. And I, was born and raised in the Seattle area, other than living in Southern California for several years. And so I'm sort of a product of the Pacific Northwest. There are some Christians here, I'm glad to say. There are a lot of problems too. But anyway, so that's just a thumbnail sketch of me.
That's great. Would this be your first book that you've written? I mean, it's very personal. You share a lot of your personal story in it, but it's more of a cultural commentary book on the state of the church and evangelicalism today. Would that be fair to say?
I think so. Yeah, my prior books were either academic on the American founding or on the impact of scientism or C.S. Lewis and things. So this is a very personal book, and it gets to issues that I've been seeing in the church for some time that I haven't really written about extensively before.
Yeah, and I appreciated the reference to Francis Schaeffer in one of the last books he wrote, The Great Evangelical Disaster, a great book everyone should go pick up. I guess what inspired you, as somebody who's mainly written on science, policy, the founding, that kind of thing, to then turn your attention to the problems you identify in Stockholm Syndrome Christianity?
Yeah, it was the growing realization that, as a conservative Christian, as a theologically and culturally conservative Christian, a lot of the time I focus on, the bad things that secularists are doing, or atheists or agnostics. I think those of us who are theologically conservative Christians, we like to blame a lot of what's happening on atheist secularists. And by all means, they're doing lots of bad stuff. But I had increasingly come to the recognition that a lot of these things are actually, unfortunately, have been also encouraged and abetted, and in some cases even led, by leading lights among evangelical Christians, and actually also among some Catholic Christians too. But and so that Houston, we have a problem. We need to get our own house in order. And I even see, recent books by otherwise people who are good people saying, if we just recruited more Christians into politics or academia. Well, in fact, there are quite a number of people in politics and academia who identify as Christians. In fact, there aren't that many even today who identify as atheists and agnostics in those areas of public life. Now, in academia, it's a little different. But that hasn't helped, because if they're Stockholm Syndrome Christians, which we can talk about, then they're just aping the world. And so they're just aiding and abetting the problem. And so the realization to me came that we need to get our own house in order. And actually, when I was walking and praying one day, it just hit me, this idea of Stockholm Syndrome was actually explaining what I had seen among my colleagues when I was a college professor, and in my work at Discovery Institute, people I've dealt with at other Christian and secular colleges who claim the name of Christ, that this was sort of an interesting description that of explained what I was seeing.
Yeah, and I want to ask about that. Before I just want to offer, this is a unique approach you're taking, because I think for the last 20 years, I'm younger. I would say ever since kind of the literature around the emergent movement and Rob Bell, Blue Light Jazz, Donald Miller, there has been a propensity of evangelicals to be self-abasing about how they're misrepresenting the gospel, and they would have the same starting point. We should take responsibility for how the church has failed, but they would take it in a totally different direction.
Yeah.
And their appeal is not to reform the church, to build it up in her faithfulness, but instead to either see the lost saved or come to church, and almost to apologize for Christianity itself to the world. So I found your book incredibly refreshing for that sense, because I share that kind of conviction that we need the church to kind of rise up. We need the church to be bold and faithful in its convictions and disciple its people. And so we should take responsibility where we see the culture going awry around us. We should take stock of how that happened, especially in an otherwise Christian country where, we did hold a kind of prominent place in public life for so long. How did we kind of fail at maintaining order and civility in society and propagating the gospel message? So I just really appreciate the approach there. You mentioned Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. Why don't you kind of share with the listeners what are we talking about with somebody who behaves like a Stockholm Syndrome Christian?
Yeah. So uh, the the reason I glom onto this is I think we sometimes rush to judgment to other people and think that they're doing it just because they're cowards or because they're loving the world. And I think there is a lot of truth to that, and that plays into what I'm talking about. But I was meeting people who I think are sincere Christians. And but the way they were acting and the beliefs that they were pushing and they thought they were being heroic was getting so far afield from Christianity. And so trying to understand that. So the Stockholm Syndrome goes back to this sort of iconic bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden in the 1970s, hence Stockholm Syndrome, where these bank robbers held hostage several bank employees. And then a few days into it, something strange happened. Those employees, rather than being antagonists to the people who are holding them captive, ended up having warm and grateful feelings. And think, oh, these are nice young men, and they actually end up feeling grateful towards the people who are holding them captive. And so I thought, this really explains, I think, what I've been seeing among some of my colleagues and other Christian leaders who I think personally do believe in Jesus. Now, there are people who just completely fall away, and we can talk about that. But seeing people personally believe in Jesus, but they, in their worldview and in what they're actually promoting, they actually are looking more like the world. And so, if you think about it, Christians today who go, in America at least, who go into culture forming uh, industries, whether it be politics or entertainment or the news media or the church or academia, they spend their life being surrounded by people who really hate Christianity. They may not hate Christians personally, but they're just antithetical to the beliefs of Christianity in graduate school, in the professions. And so one way that some Christians can take from that, if you've spent a lot of time where your colleagues are have very different assumptions and very different beliefs, is that rubs off on you and you begin identifying more with them than with your historic Christian faith. And so we're called as Christians to be salt and light in culture, and really missionaries of Christ and truth and culture. But I say when you become a Stockholm Syndrome Christian, you're actually becoming a missionary from the secularist culture to your fellow Christians. And so you actually tell yourself that you're being courageous and standing up for truth by calling out all of your Christian brethren for, say, embracing biblical marriage, or for believing that Jesus is the only way, or others. So you adopt the mindset of the other side and actually think you're being a good Christian to do it.
It's wild. I've seen this over and over again. I remember, back in 2020 when I was offering some commentary on, the lockdowns and other measures, and I was just trying to remind Christians to have hope that, it may be a season where there may be significant death, but we can take hope in Christ and we should offer that hope to other people. And I had Christians get mad at me because they said I was embarrassing them to the lost. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. And many of these worked in tech or they were part of campus ministries. And basically the strategy, and I don't know when this started, but the strategy has been for a lot of these Stockholm Syndrome Christians is to basically just ditch or make fun of or alienate anyone who I guess would be more conservative than them, or the traditional trope of, making fun of the fundamentalist in order to gain an audience with like the SNL crowd, to say, I'm not like that dumb Christian. I'm not like, in order to appease them. And I just find that pretty repugnant behavior. Yes. You've been around this stuff for a while. Is this something you noticed is a recent phenomenon? Have you noticed it going on just over time? When would you say you started seeing this happen kind of at a mass scale?
I would say, at least in my lifetime, it was in the 1990s. And now we can go back. There are a lot of interesting things of struggles before then, but in the 1990s, so in the 70s, you had a real shakeout among evangelical Christians over biblical authority and things. And because of people like Francis Schaeffer, who I didn't know personally, although I am friends with his son-in-law, who has endorsed my book, a very Randall Macaulay, who is a wonderful Christian in England. But people like Schaeffer and a lot of others really stood up and I think brought back at least numbers of Christians to faithfulness in the 70s and early 80s, and that provided a really helpful push for good things. But then by the 90s, in a way, that had become so successful that it began to atrophy. And I would count, so in academia, one of the things you mentioned, the scandal of the evangelical mind. Well, actually, the book on the scandal of the evangelical mind by Mark Knoll, I would actually count as pushing part of what you're talking about. So, the underlying thesis, to some degree, is good, that evangelicals should consider the life of the mind. But if you actually read the details of that book, and I was a college professor at the time, and see how it was discussed on Christian college campuses, is, well, how do you judge whether evangelical professors or pundits, for that matter, are excellent or have a mind? It's not by the truth of the Bible or the Christian tradition. It's by what the New York Times says. It's by what Harvard says. It's by what CNN says. And so the whole movement, at least I saw it certainly in Christian academia, over the scandal of the evangelical mind, which was, the point of being excellent in scholarship and making a mark in the world is great. The problem is, Mark Knoll was criticizing what he called biblicism, which basically was, in his view, just following what the Bible says. And although he said in the book initially that, I'm not meaning that you just take your cues from what the secular culture says. So he sort of had a couple sentences on that, but that's not how it was taken. And so I was, in real time, in the 12 years that I was a college professor, this idea that Christians should engage the world, it sounds great. And in fact, I agree with that. But what it actually meant was embrace the world, be liked by the world, and that we're being relevant. We're following Christ if the New York Times loves us, to put it really crudely, or if Harvard loves us. And Mark Knoll, now whether maybe that wasn't his original view, but interestingly, he just published an anniversary version of that book a couple of years ago, sort of in the midst of COVID things. And he sort of took the gloves off. I mean, he now defines, if you have a mind, that means that you have to believe in Darwinian evolution. You have to believe in, global warming catastrophism. You can't think there were any problems in the 2020 election. You can't have any concerns over COVID. So he was defining ideologically that a life of the mind was his policies, prescriptions.
Wow.
And so I do think that in the 90s, and then you had people like Tim Keller, who I think is a tragic figure. I do think in some sense he was a Stockholm Syndrome Christian. He was this, really PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, pastor in New York, who was influential on, when I was a Presbyterian elder, we read Tim Keller because he's, how you have a church in an urban city and be a faithful evangelical. Well, I think Tim Keller early on was a pretty faithful evangelical, and he actually stood out on things like biblical marriage. But as the culture got worse, Tim morphed along with it. By the ending years of his life, he wasn't saying the things publicly that he said in the early years, and he helped put forward this idea of a false idea of winsomeness. I think Christians should be winsome. I think we should be loving, but that doesn't mean that you kowtow to the culture, and that doesn't mean that you take your cues from, that you're trying to reach, say, the people in New York City, so you only want to say things that will attract them and not offend anyone there. The gospel is scandalous. And in fact, the more the culture gets corrupted, the more scandalous it's going to be. But Tim Keller and some others actually, in a strange sort of way, they thought they were God's press agent, saving God from himself. And I saw this at the local church level where I was an elder. Oh, we'll turn away people if we actually make clear our views on this, no matter how lovingly. But, really, now it's one thing, yes, Christians can be unduly abrasive. They can be unloving. There's, pharisaical attitudes. I get all that. But I have to say, in the evangelical churches that I grew up in and in evangelical higher education, the problem wasn't legalism, no matter what Tim Keller says. It wasn't Pharisees, maybe Pharisees on the left, but it was not Pharisees. It was that people were always watering down what their basic beliefs were, and they were doing it in the name of, well, we're promoting the gospel because we don't want there to be obstacles to people. Well, yes, we shouldn't place obstacles for other people, between us and the gospel and in sharing that. But if that's for our own sinfulness and stuff. So we shouldn't be doing stuff that, living a life, abandoning our wives, or, doing things that really would turn people off for valid reasons for the gospel. But if your definition of an obstacle to the gospel is basically, well, what God says is too controversial, so God is an obstacle to the gospel, that's a problem.
It's a big problem. Yeah, it's a big problem, and I've noticed this is it plagues, and that's what's funny to me, John, is Tim Keller is, like you said, one figure, tragic figure on this particular issue, but this is everywhere. Like with people
Yes.
who have never heard of Tim Keller, this is like so in the water, in the pulpits, in the discipleship ministries, in the curriculum, and how we've represented our faith publicly. It's been so kind of the North Star has been saving souls for so long, and we could get into kind of the history of revivalism in America and why that is, and um, but for many Christians, they're kind of guided by a false view of what it means to put obstacles in front of people, and that the
Yeah.
obstacle, what's funny is they should be talking about like what the Bible defines as sin, and that's how we understand what is loving, what is not loving, and instead they want to talk about notions of love and being perceived as loving, kind of like what you talked about as a PR agent, and it really disgusts me. I mean, it's not, it's if you buck that as someone in ministry or just a Christian, you'll quite often get shouted down, told you're being divisive, unloving, that kind of thing. And what would the world think, our public witness and all that. So it's a really big problem that you're tackling in this book. So I appreciate it a lot. You were at Seattle Pacific University, and your story in the book, you bring it up kind of throughout the book as a case study. Tell me about your time at Seattle Pacific University and what you noticed there.
Yeah, so Seattle Pacific University is a explicitly vowed evangelical Christian university, like Wheaton, like others that they claim to be. It was established in the mid 19th century or later 19th century, actually by Christians who were concerned because the first wave of Christian colleges and universities like Princeton, Harvard, Yale, by the mid 19th century had fallen away. We lost them, even though they were established explicitly as explicitly Christian institutions. And so I give great credit to the evangelicals in the mid to late 19th century in America, who they then founded a whole bunch of new institutions to say, we do need collegiate and other education. We're not going to, we may not be able to take back over Harvard, but we are going to establish new institutions. And those institutions did a lot of good work for a long time. I think they were really challenged in the 1970s, and we could talk about that. But then now, I think big time, many of these. So Seattle Pacific is a member of the college, the consortium of Christian colleges and universities, and so it's an evangelical Christian school, supposedly. So I was there for 12 years. Two stories that bookend what happened that really sort of summarize what happened. When I got there, there was a mix on the faculty. Seattle Pacific, in a very secular region of the country, had stood for Christ, and brought in people like Francis Schaeffer and others in the '60s, and was known for its evangelical Christianity and helped train people going into all sorts of culture-forming disciplines. But by the time I was there was already shakiness. But they did have a solid board, and so when I was hired for the tenure track position, I was warned by the faculty board that interviewed me, by one of the, we have a very theologically conservative board of trustees. They just turned down for tenure one of our theologians. And they were thinking they were, giving me some good advice on how to survive. But when I heard that, I was saying privately, great, you actually have a board that is trying to safeguard the mission of the institution. And they did. But what I saw over 12 years, when they hired a new president, he basically convinced the board that it wasn't their position to govern. They were there as window dressing. They were there maybe to raise money, but not really to safeguard the mission of the university. So the year I ended up leaving also happened to be a year where I was trying to defend a fellow faculty member who had been hired while I was there, a very dynamic evangelical conservative Christian, who the faculty were trying to deny tenure to, basically because he was too evangelical. He had great scholarship, but basically he was too evangelical. He was also politically conservative. He made the mistake, I tell in the book, of, while he was untenured, of actually criticizing a senior faculty member who was calling George W. Bush Hitler.
Oh, wow.
And so that didn't earn him, and so, it was impolitic for him to do that before he had tenure. So, but then so the board, what does the board do? The board rubber stamps it. So you go from a board that basically is doing its role and actually eject someone who's heterodox to, at the end, rubber stamping the left-wing and unchristian faculty, increasingly getting rid of one of the few people who are still evangelicals at the institution. That, in a nutshell, is what happened at Seattle Pacific. And we can go into the reasons why, but I think the main reason why, and this is applicable at most other Christian colleges that have fallen away and churches, is that the board was AWOL. I respect, even though I disagree with all of the woke faculty, if you will, who were departing from the faith, because in some sense they actually thought what they were doing is right, even though I think it was wrong. But we had a board that was filled with biblically conservative people from business and from the sponsoring church. They were involved in evangelical missions to China. They were involved in parachurch ministries. So the board, in their personal beliefs, were definitely solid. But when push came to shove, they were not willing to keep their institution solid. And I'd say that if you're a Christian who's called to be on a board, whether of your church or your Christian school, let alone a Christian university, if you're not willing to safeguard the faithfulness, the biblical faithfulness of your institution, you should not be on that board. Your number one goal as overseeing a Christian institution is not raising money or doing PR it's keeping the institution to its mission. And so I still, I talk about in the book, and I do grapple with and bring it before God. I still do have some struggle with, and they weren't all bad board members. There were some board members who actually did try to stand up, but they were outvoted. So I should be clear about that. But I still do have a hard time grappling with the Christians who actually know the truth and sincerely know what's true and have the responsibility to uphold it and choose not to. I think I really wouldn't want to be in their shoes, because unlike the people who are sincerely wrong and pushing something that yet they have been misled, if you know what's right and you're not willing to stand up for it, that's in a really sorry situation.
Yeah. So what do you think, you talked about kind of the transition to a new president and the board developing a different temperament towards someone like this professor who would not even endorse Trump, but say, he's not Hitler, like that's, or not Trump, sorry, Bush.
It was Bush.
Yeah, Bush is Hitler. So they've been doing this for a long time. But, what do you think, what got, did they read an article? Were they listening to Tim Keller's sermons? Give me some insight into without divulging anything you don't want to, but what happened? How did they become Stockholm Syndrome Christians? Because we don't want to be that. What do you think went on there?
Yeah. So I think I have to differentiate in general from Stockholm Syndrome Christians. With regard to the board, at the time they made the decision, they weren't Stockholm Syndrome Christians. They were led to believe by the president who appeared to be a theologically conservative Christian, got them to trust him, trust without verification. And he convinced them that it was the bad old days of the board when they were contentious by denying tenure. And so just trust the administration. They'll do the vetting. And so you don't really need to do it and you shouldn't interfere. And so this generally, I think especially for college education, and this is what I think a lot of non-academics don't understand. The dynamics of boards at Christian colleges is they're basically told, you're not wanted. You're here to support us, but you're not an expert. You're not an expert theologian. You're not this, you're not that. So you're here to bring in money. You're here to give PR for the school, and you're here to support us. And that if you try to do anything else, you're not an expert. Why should you contradict me because I'm a chair of biblical theology, even if I'm teaching something that's heterodox for the last 2,000 years? Sure. You have no groundings. And if you do that, you're being unloving or you're being this or that. And that's actually, I think, how they were persuaded. That's sort of the first step of where people who are still biblically faithful are sold this line of goods. Well, you're not an expert on this area, so you can't even see black and white. Well, I'm sorry. Everyone needs to be accountable. And my number one suggestion, if someone is on a board of either a church or a Christian school or a Christian university, is don't be cowed when people try to pull rank on you and say, well, you just don't understand. At the very least, you can say, well, explain it to me. And if what they says sounds heterodox or seems to contradict everything you know to be true, you could bring in someone from the other side. If you don't feel adequate to grapple with it, bring in someone who's another academic who is on the orthodox side and force your heterodox person to justify themselves in front of them. And don't be cowed, because that is, I think that they were cowed by the, we're not experts here, and we don't want to be divisive because we want to be loving and grace-filled, which meant we basically rubber stamp what the administration and the faculty do. So in the particular academic context, I think many of the Christians who think, what it will take, you can actually reform Christian higher education, but it's going to take a lot more than even donors not writing the checks. It's going to take recruiting good board members, and then those board members are going to have to be willing to actually be turnaround executives and actually clean house. And I've seen that in a couple of cases. Actually, had an interesting conversation with the college president of a Christian university I didn't know about really before, and I don't feel I can divulge who it is, but that where they actually apparently have done what I just said in the last 3 years. So it's possible, but I've also seen places where they don't do it, even if they know it needs to be done. And they also think it's the cooked frog problem. They think, well, it's not so terrible now, but they don't realize if you're on the wrong trajectory. This is like Seattle Pacific. When I was there, even though it was changing, most faculty members, I think, would have been in some sense pro-life. Most faculty members would have been in some sense for biblical marriage. But then you get, like 2 or 3 years ago, you have a survey of 72% of the faculty at my former institution now are on record as opposing the university's statement on biblical marriage, which was not a complicated statement. It basically, marriage is supposed to be lifelong monogamous between a man and a woman. And 72%, if you have 72% of your faculty who are opposing biblical marriage, you don't actually have a Christian institution anymore.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, that story is illuminating because it's just one case study, but I can think of so many examples of this. I'm an alumni of Denver Seminary. I haven't been shy about kind of naming them publicly as an institution that's done this. I was never on faculty or anything like that, but as an alumni, I sense, it's on my resume, and that's where I went. And, their reputation goes with me, and right back at them in some ways that, the reputation I have as a minister goes with their educational institution. And I watched them just compromise left and right on everything. They were always trying to bring in, secularists to teach Christians on everything from gun control to climate change to race, because they're trying to do, be a respectable Christian institution in the eyes of the world. And I don't know what's going on there. I have no knowledge about what's going on there other than what I can see, which is what you're talking about. Seattle Pacific University is similar to what's happening.
Denver, Calvin University, Fuller, of course, people are following the news just a few days ago. Fuller's board, Fuller Seminary in California, is sort of one of the deans of evangelical seminaries, basically issued a statement saying that it was upholding its biblical statement on marriage. But in fact, it wasn't, because it went on to say that, but biblically faithful people or faithful Christians can have the opposite view.
Wow.
Well, and what does this mean practically? Right now on Fuller, there is a faculty member, Christopher Hayes, who wrote a book with his dad, who has since deceased, who was also a theologian, last year, advocating that Christians need to accept gay marriage. Now, to his credit, in their book, he and his dad actually say, well, the original biblical teaching was something else, but God changes his mind all the time, so should we. That's basically the argument of the book. He's one of Fuller's key faculty members. So what does it mean to say, as a board, that we're upholding our statement when you have faculty who are teaching the students and actually teaching the nation, crusading against that view? You are, at the very least, you're deluding yourself. You're lying to yourself. If you're a board member of Fuller who actually thinks that you're upholding the view by saying that, we have this statement, but faithful Christians can agree with the opposite, and in fact, we're going to allow having faculty who do. The number one thing an institution of higher education does, what is its product? It teaches students. So if you have a paper statement, but you hire faculty who are undermining it, you're not being faithful to that statement. And these boards are deluding themselves at the most charitable interpretation. And I do think some of them have convinced themselves this is a third way. It's not a third way. And when you mentioned chapel at Denver, the other way this is often sold, and sold with boards, I mean, well, we need to be open to diversity of views and hear different things. And I'm actually respectful of that in the collegiate atmosphere. You do want to challenge and study different views. But actually, what's really happening in most of these places, and that's what certainly Seattle Pacific is, they're not bringing in, say, someone who has two different views as a Christian on climate change. They're bringing in one person. They're not bringing in, say, Voddie Baucham as well as someone who promotes critical race theory. They're bringing in only one side. So let's be real. It's often sold first as, let's just have this diversity of views. Let's expose people so that we can critically assess this. But actually, usually the people who are arguing that, they're not willing to bring in the people who have the more orthodox views, because that would model to students that the usual line we had at Seattle Pacific was, the professors who were going against biblical authority is, well, that's your naive Sunday school view. And so here you, and so okay, what's a student to think? Who they're not experts. They see their expert authority figures who are supposed to be Christians who are arguing this. But if the school were to actually bring in people on the other side who are equally expert, who are actually reinforcing the traditional teaching of Christianity, suddenly the students would recognize, well, actually, maybe there is, maybe what I originally believed is right, but they don't want to allow that to happen. They want them to be captive. So one of the issues that was really one of the forefront issues in the years that I was at Seattle Pacific theologically was open theism, the idea that God himself doesn't know the future. And that was what our theologians taught. And I would have students come into me, I was their advisor, who were distraught. And so then I would give them other books, but I would ask them, so are you given any of these other people, traditional theologians who are arguing for the traditional Christian position? No, we only got this one view. And so let's be real about this inclusivity. I'm not actually against appropriate inclusivity, especially at college, of studying and critiquing. I would say, views sort of compare it to the Bible, but that's actually not what's happening. It's the Christian colleges and are some of the least inclusive when it comes to biblical orthodox beliefs. Now, again, there are some that are not, but I'm just saying the tenor of many, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I saw this, I think it might have been 2020, maybe 21, Veritas Forum was going to host something, I think it was in Seattle, and they were going to debate critical race theory, I believe it was. And they got a large outcry because their more conservative person they were bringing in on that topic was against critical race theory, and they ended up just canceling the event. It was pretty shocking when I saw that, because Veritas Forum kind of prides itself in what you're talking about, holding these kind of debates to do this, and this is just all over the place in evangelicalism. It's really, really sad.
And I would say with Veritas is an interesting story, because I think they had a very wonderful beginning at places like Harvard, where they did do some of that. But well before the critical race theory, let's look in the area of science. The only person that they were willing to champion was Francis Collins, who is one of the worst examples you would ever want for being a Christian in the sciences. And I'm not doubting, he personally believes Jesus is his savior, but whether you look at life issues, sexuality issues, what happened during COVID, I would say his embrace of a more extreme version of sort of unguided Darwinian evolution. That was the respectable Christian evangelical, because he was in Time magazine, and so actually Veritas has also shut out a lot of other people in other areas, well before the debate that you're talking about.
So with this stuff, I mean, if the listener is seeing what I'm seeing, or maybe they're just coming to terms with this, maybe they didn't realize how bad it was. What are some things they should be looking for regarding leaders compromising biblical truth? How can they, be discerning if they're going, okay, I hear you. I got the same thing. I had Megan Basham on the program, and I got phone calls from pastors. Wow, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. what should I do about it? How can I, and we've already kind of talked about board governance, but maybe more broadly, how can Christians develop a better sense of discernment for when they need to speak up, when they need to say something, if that's what they should do, but what can they do to help themselves?
Yeah, thanks for raising that, because I do say, and I think Megan's book was great, and I did a lot online, sort of defending some of her book against some really phony detractors. But I will say, I think one of the things my book brings to it is I do focus a lot on what people can do, and also the root causes, so that we can surmount it. So the first several chapters are on the critique, but then it's where is this coming from, and then what are things we can do. And so I think, well, let me just go down quickly a few things. So number one, this is sort of a root cause, but it also, if you're a pastor, or if you're a parent, or if you're a Christian school teacher, or is do an analysis of where are you actually getting your information about the world from. And I think a lot of Christians think that, well, to be well read, let's just read. They get their information from the New York Times or CNN or TikTok or certain social media accounts or Christianity Today. These sort of mainstream sources, or even mainstream evangelical sources, and they think that really gives them an accurate view of the world. Or they think that they'll be discerning enough that they could just read it and they'll just see through things, and it won't have an impact on them. But when I've actually looked at people who I know personally who've gone down the path of what I'm calling Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, in most of those cases, it's, if you look at where they're getting their information from the world, it's from the same secular sources. And I will say, if even if you have a biblical view, say on sexuality, if you listen to sources that give a drumbeat of, well, science says that there are 10 different gender orientations, or that you're encased in a certain lifestyle, you can't leave it, or if science says that a drumbeat, and you never hear the other experts or the other sides that is out there, then you're going to be expressing, no matter what your personal beliefs are, at best, you're going to start being embarrassed by those beliefs, and you're going to think, well, maybe they're true sort of for me, but they're not true for other people. And so if you get your information from bad places, then you are setting up a problem for you and your kids. And this is all down the line. Let's talk about, if someone's a Christian who thinks, oh, pro-lifers are violent and they're a problem because they're so extreme. Well, if you believe that, chances are you've simply been reading the New York Times or the Washington Post, and you don't know the fact that, in fact, it's not the pro-lifers that are violent. It's, we have had, since the end of Roe v. Wade, over 500-600 attacks on churches and pro-life centers, but you're not going to get that from CNN. And so where you get your info, so the number one thing is do an analysis of where you're getting your information. And I do this on my website. The good news is there are lots of information sources now that actually do provide better sources of information. And so podcasts like this one, but not just podcasts. News sources. The Christian Post actually gives great reporting about the transgender issue for their main reporter there, Brandon Showalter, did really great service on exposing that factually for the last umpteen years. And so there are great sources. So do an analysis of where you are getting your information, where you're allowing your kids to get their information, where you're getting your entertainment. Because another thing is that the stories we watch, for many people, are more powerful than the news stories they read. And even so-called family-friendly places like Disney, they're not family-friendly. The numbers of people, let's just take sexuality, where it's shown as a given that you can't live according to biblical sexuality. That's basically, whether it be adultery, whether it be sex outside of marriage, whether it be LGBTQ, that's their picture of the world. And if you only watch stories that show that is going to change the views of you or your kids. So I spent a little too much time on this, but focus on the information inputs that you're getting. And like I said, my book, but more my website, which is free, people don't need to buy the book. There's a section of resources that gives just a sampling of places that you might consider getting more of your information from. So that's one thing. I'd say, a really basic thing. So I have one chapter where I give actually 21 practical things to do. Several of them are for board members. We've talked about why that's important. But here's something any Christian can do. Maybe you're feeling overwhelmed. You don't have to, maybe you're not called to actually change the world and everything. You can't do everything. But at the very least, you can do no harm. By what I mean by that is, well, if you're a faithful Christian, you're a member of a church and you should be, active in it. You may send your kids to a Christian school. You should be tithing. You should be supporting Christian organizations. But where are your time, talent, and treasure going? Now, I'm not one who recommends people willy-nilly lead their local churches. In the last church that my wife and I were in at, and I was an elder there, we were there for 18 years. So I'm not, on the other hand, there are some bright line tests. And if your church or pastor or elders end up going over that, you have no business staying there. And I know people in my own area where there was a large mega church that was fairly biblically faithful until the pastor went off the deep end in redefining marriage. And the numbers of people who didn't agree with that, who stayed, is tragic. Well, they stayed because they had friends there, or they stayed because of this. But you understand, you're more culpable than that pastor is. That pastor somehow thought what he was doing is right. I think he is accountable for being wrong on that because the Bible is clear. But nonetheless, at least he thought what he was doing is right. But what he's saying is wrong. Yet if you're staying and donating money, volunteering your time, taking your kids there, even though they may not be getting good teaching, you're part of the problem. You're actually worse. And so, before you think, well, I can't save the world. Well, God's not asking you to save the world. He is asking you to be faithful. And so how are you using your time, talent, and treasure? This also means maybe you went to a Christian university 30 years ago or 20 years ago. That was good at the time. But maybe you know that now it's not. Do you write a check every year to help that university because of your warm feelings of the past? Well, then again, you're part of the problem. So that's another practical thing. One other thing, again, this is not rocket science, but ask yourself honestly, if you're a parent, who is raising your kids? Is it really you, or is it social media? Is it TikTok? Is it the public schools if you send them there? Or are you relying, no matter how good your church is, on a couple hours a week of youth group? I mean, who is raising your kids? And give an honest answer to that, because I think that's one of the highest callings of many Christians, is as a parent and a equipper and a mentor for this whole next generation. And there are all sorts of things, practical things you can do to engage in discussions with your kids, to make sure that the things that you're watching together as a family, you don't have to be an expert on everything, but you can acquaint your kids with stuff so that when they go through their life, not only do they have good habits and that they walk with Christ, but that they have a sufficient understanding of the grounding that Christianity is actually true, and that when they go to high school or college, or see a TikTok influencer who's making these claims as if they know what they're talking about, your kids will know enough, because they've seen other people who are equally expert, that they know what they're talking about, that they will have what my late friend Phil Johnson used to say, they will have a baloney detector that they will be able to recognize. And in fact, where you see this, there are good spots right now. I think homeschooling, we homeschooled our kids after a couple of years of public schooling, where they actually had good teachers, and my wife was really active in the local public school. But after that, we homeschooled them through mid-high school. And I will say, in the homeschool community, understands that parents really need to be in control of the education of the kids. And so what happened is, in Washington State, basically the state will pay for a free community college education in high school for the upper two divisions. And a lot of homeschoolers take advantage of that. And there are some educational issues with that. Why would you cede anything to the state? On the other hand, I mean, our kids did it. But what was really interesting to me is that there were now so many homeschoolers that were attending this local community college where our kids went, that not only were they the best students there, so even the liberal faculty sort of liked them, but they were able, because they had been taught appropriately, they actually were agents of truth in that community college. And when the professors would say something really outlandish, they would challenge them in a loving way. And it was, a sight to behold, hearing these stories from my kids. And they did some things too that I'm actually very proud of, but it was also other people. And so if you do it right, your kids will have the appropriate baloney detector so that when they do confront the stuff out there, they'll be able to laugh it off and see through it.
Yeah, and I see that happen a lot within Christian communities, even at younger ages, who, amongst many of my friends who are pastors, who have kids, most either homeschooled or private Christian education, that desire to develop in them kind of that baloney detector. It starts even younger now
Yes.
because there's so much
Yes.
nonsense out there, and it's so apparent and it's in your face, especially in a secular town like Boulder, where you've
Yep.
got the rainbow flag, the transgender flag, all this kind of stuff, and the kids are asking, "What's that?" And you have to tell them, and you have to do it age appropriate way, but you need to tell them this is non-Christian stuff, and this we don't like that. That's bad, and so they begin to develop that. One of the things, kind of closing out, I did want to highlight, since you come from the academy, you're obviously well published, and I live in one of the most educated counties in America, and so the Christians we attract in Boulder are typically well educated also, and in kind of a well-educated population, they're very liberal in their ideal. So they like we've talked about already, they want to have this kind of idea where they can entertain all ideas and then come to a certain position within that set of ideas. So a practical example would be during kind of the BLM riots and all that stuff. We're trying to educate our church on some problems. Thankfully, one of my professors from Denver Seminary, he's no longer there. He's at Cornerstone. Doug Grotice, he wrote a book called Fire in the Streets. That was a helpful critique. But a lot of my church members had been exposed to teachers like Matt Chandler, J.D. Greer, Andy Stanley, Russell Moore, Tim Keller. And I had to take responsibility for that because a lot of them heard of them from me. And so I took responsibility for that. But by following them on Instagram, wherever it was, they were starting reading the books they were promoting, and they would start attending church, with their messages. And so like a book like Jamar Tisby's on race in America. And they would say, "Hey, Pastor, I'm thinking about reading this." And I would just tell them you shouldn't, and I think for people who are about the life of the mind, for Christians who are about that, when I said that was not received well. They're like, "Well, I can discern for myself." And I'm like, yeah, I mean, like, yes, but like, this is it's not going to be helpful for you. You're not pairing it with something that's like Vodi Baucham's book. Like if you were going to do Vodi Baucham, Jamar Tisby, read them both, let's talk. That sounds fun, interesting. But we're not doing that. You're just reading these books that are being propagated. So what they're scared of, and they've been told, is that Christians are stupid. They shouldn't live in an echo chamber. They don't want to be tribal. They don't want to, all this kind of stuff. They have all these scare words. You don't want to live in a bubble, all this kind of stuff. So what would you say to that type of Christian to help them kind of adopt what you say is a more discerning kind of approach to how we engage the life of the mind?
So I think you've hit on a really key point in what you just said, which is that many of the people, they say they're doing this for the life of the mind and because we need to be open and discerning, but what they are doing is just shoveling in one side. And so if you listen to nonstop Jamar Tisby, or let alone the white fragility person, if that's all you're listening to, that is going to transform you. And that's not actually being open. Why aren't you reading Vodi Baucham, Carol Swain, all sorts of other people who are, let alone secular, like Thomas Sowell? Why aren't you being willing to engage that? And so call their bluff, call their hypocrisy. I mean, you don't need to be harsh like that, but just saying, okay, if you're willing to do that, so here are 3 books that you should also read. Because I actually think that if it's caught early enough with people and they actually have to confront the well-considered, well-grounded thing, then it becomes harder to bamboozle them. Obviously, if you're talking about people further down the path, then they just don't want to see it. But then, I mean, short of God convicting them, they're not going to change. But at least you should call their bluff to say that they're not actually being open-minded because they're not actually willing to consider Orthodox Christian positions that go against what they think. And so this was something this was one of the reasons why we left the church after 18 years that we were at. There were a couple, but one was they established a racial justice task force, but it was, which I want to be honest, I do think there are some pernicious things on the right in right now on race issues. I think that the Bible does teach an appropriate view of equality, and there are some shameful things in our history, and so I don't discount that. Having said that, if you're reading A Never-Ending Diet of Jemar Tisby et al. On the left, you are getting a very unbiblical view of that whole situation. And so what my wife and I tried to do in this situation, we weren't on this task force, but we tried to suggest other things that they should be considering. And mostly those were not considered. And so, to call the bluff that if you're really trying to actually investigate, then you really need to be willing to actually consider the side that that isn't favored by the secular elites right now. And so I think the reason actually to push that is because there are a lot of people who are not yet that completely far down the path, who are, I can think of people in my mind who legitimately, for right reasons, were concerned about, say, some of the racial tensions in America and wanting to get a handle on that. And so they were being sold a bill of goods that the way to do that is to go to this unbiblical route. And those are the people who I have the most heart for, because if you're not standing up and modeling another way, they're either going to go down the woke left part, or I actually think some of the things on the right where we actually have some Christians praising Hitler and advocating for genuine racism, I think is partly because so many centrist Christians abandoned solid biblical teaching. And so you had particularly young men thinking that the only way, the only option they were seeing as a Christian was to be, a Jemar Tisby or a white fragility person. And then that led to a backlash to some very bad things. But part of the reason for that backlash is because the Russell Moores of the world, for example, were not willing to model the true biblical teaching on it. And so they're partly responsible. And everyone is responsible for themselves, but still, the Christian leaders who didn't do this. Now, I will say, and I'm not a great, I know the Gospel Coalition has become very controversial and very wimpy on some things, but I have to say, for me personally, one of the best things that I think came out of 2020 was Kevin DeYoung wrote a series of things that were collected. You can get them for free. I think I cite them on a website on the Bible and race issues. And I was so appreciative of that because, number one, he actually did ground what he was saying in the Bible. A lot of these so-called biblical racial reconciliation, it may proof text a sentence out of the Bible out of context, and it'd be one part Bible and 90 part things that are not. DeYoung, in this case, did a deep dive into the Bible, and then also on public policy issues over, say, policing and other issues, he outlined the major different positions and footnoted resources on both sides. And so I actually thought, I actually tried to encourage our church at the time to study that didn't quite get accepted. But so I do think for people who are going down that path is not allow them the satisfaction because they're patting themselves on the back. Well, we're being open and considering this stuff, but actually they're closed-minded. They're not being open.
It's wild. And that's what I did try to do that with another Christian I knew, and they were reading, a book on kingdom diversity by one of these people who are pushing kind of DEI stuff. And I was like, okay, you're committed to reading it. I'll read it with you and we can have a discussion. And they're like, no, I don't want to do that. I can read it on my own and to come to my own conclusions. And I'm like, this problem is deep. And I also, it makes me question a lot more than like how many Christians are actually capable of the life of the mind. They say what they want to be, because, at the end of the day, you could put the shoe on the other foot. I'm a Christian. I follow the Bible. And so you want to call their bluff. You want to appeal to their kind of what they perceive to be their virtue. But I also don't want to give up. And I don't want to, in so doing, endorse the virtue as if it's a virtue in itself. Like it's not, if you want to be a life of the mind person, be willing to engage all sides. I called this out in Acts 29. I called this out anytime I saw it, because anytime I would ask questions. What about Thomas Sowell? You're recommending all these other people. They even recommended, white fragility at one point. They recommended W.B. Du Bois, all this stuff. And I was like, Thomas Sowell, there's all these other documentaries. We could watch a documentary on what happened in Ferguson. And they just constantly shut me down. So I do think there's a bit of fallacy in the liberal mind, where everyone is of the life of the mind and everyone's capable of discerning truth on their own, and that we should just be. So you do want to call their bluff, but I also have a hard time giving up the ground where it's like, but I also like, you don't have to waste a lot of time. Like, I have a whole bookshelf over here on CRT because I'm a conservative and I was trying to do the life of the mind kind of approach. And I was like, fine, I'll read your books. And I didn't like any of them, and I found them unbiblical, and I wasted so much money and time doing that. And so I don't think the life of the mind is for everyone. Is that fair to say? Does that sound bad?
That is fair to say. I mean, I think that one reason it is helpful for pastors and those who are leading other Christians to have to read some of those things is to be able to see the forms of what Francis Schaeffer would call the forms of the world spirit today, so that you can help people to understand why that isn't right. But I think that, if you are a solid Bible believing Christian, you need to be digging down in that truth. And so, spending lots of time in the slop is not where you need to be. And I would fully agree with that. And that, let's understand what Christian education mentorship historically has always been. It's discipling people, and that is focusing on God's truth and how it applies to everything. And it's not focusing on lots of errors. So I do think there's some truth to that. I think with regard to your kids and stuff, I think it's important to give enough so that they can recognize. They don't need to be expert on everything, but so that, again, they can develop a baloney, detector, so that they can recognize BS when they see it, and also realize that, say, when they hear something that may sound wrong and cut against what they've been taught, not immediately jump to, well, an expert is saying that, therefore I ought to believe it. But realize that, so they need to know enough about our elites. I mean, I have a chapter that goes through all the demographic and information we know about the media in this country and what their actual beliefs are. And, in other words, forewarned is forearmed, but you can't, that only goes so far. You can't, so I do think for ordinary people, there needs to be enough so that they know that there is a solid case that is there, that should they need to go into it, that they can, and also to develop these gifts of discerning through when they're being sold a bill of goods.
Yeah, that's right. Well, John, this was great. I want to recommend your book to people and point people to where they can pick it up. Where can people pick up a copy of Stockholm Syndrome Christianity?
Yeah, well, it's available at Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com. You can go to I'd encourage people to go to the book website, StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com, which includes links to a lot of places that sell it, but also there's a lot of free information. So one thing that, if you're considering a Christian college, I have a document on there, 10 questions to ask when considering a Christian college, because I often get questions from very concerned parents. Well, how do I know where to send my kid to college? How do I know if it's really solid? And that changes from year to year depending on what's happening. But there are some questions that if you ask, I think for example, who are they bringing in? This is usually public knowledge, something you can get at. Who are they bringing in for chapel? If it's a never-ending succession of people promoting critical race theory, the latest secular fads, then that tells you a lot. On the other hand, are they bringing in people who are defending the historicity and validity of the Bible, who are defending pro-life views of Christians, who are defending biblical sexuality, and digging deep into the Word? Then that will tell you something else. So there are a lot of free resources on my site that could be helpful to people, even if they don't pick up the book. That's great. Well, I'll point people to the site, and I'll put a link in the show notes. John, thank you so much for joining me today. Chase, thanks for having me. Well, thanks for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, share it with a friend, like it on YouTube, smash that subscribe button, as they say, and you can subscribe on podcasts as well. Leave a great rating there so that more people can find the episodes, and we will see you next time.